A dog led the police to a terrifying scene. When the officer understood the magnitude of what was happening, he couldn't hold back his tears and broke down crying. In a small town in Texas, everyone knew Toby, the dog who always seemed to be searching for something. Toby was a mixed-breed dog with brown fur, lively eyes full of curiosity. He spent his days running through the streets, playing in the park, and visiting the neighbors. Most people loved to see him and always offered him treats and pets. However, there was something mysterious about Toby. No one knew for sure where he came from or where he went at night. Toby lived like a free spirit, as if he were part of the town's landscape, but without really belonging to any particular place. He didn't have a fixed home, and no one had ever seen him enter a house or sleep in a comfortable bed. Sometimes he gave the impression that he was looking for something, perhaps a place to call home, or maybe someone. One day, Toby, the town's dog, did something out of the ordinary. Instead of simply wandering the streets and parks, he decided he needed to go to the police station. What at first seemed like a simple visit from a dog turned into something much more interesting. When Toby arrived at the station, he didn't behave like a dog who was just passing by. He acted strangely, as if he was trying to communicate something of great importance. He ran back and forth, barking and trying to get the officers' attention. They, in turn, were a bit puzzled and even somewhat annoyed. It wasn't normal for a dog to come into the station and start behaving like that. The police tried several times to shoo Toby away. They gently pushed him outside and even tried to distract him with treats and toys. But Toby wouldn't give up. Every day, he returned, always with the same attitude, barking and running around the entrance as if he was saying, "I have something important to show you." Toby was a dog on a mission, and nothing seemed to stop him. After several days of trying to get the police's attention, he finally piqued the interest of Detective Santiago. Detective Santiago watched Toby with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Although he had initially tried to ignore the dog's insistent behavior, he could no longer shake the feeling that there was more behind those barks and that unwavering determination. Toby, with his shaggy brown coat and eyes full of resolve, seemed to be leading Santiago towards something only he could understand. One afternoon, as the sun began to set behind the hills, Toby came to the station once again. This time, without hesitation, Santiago decided to follow him. The dog bolted into the street, with Santiago quickly walking behind him. At first, he thought Toby would simply lead him on a pointless stroll around the neighborhood, but he soon realized the dog was moving with clear purpose. Every move was deliberate, every turn seemed to have meaning. "Where are you taking me, boy?" Santiago murmured to himself as he followed the dog's steps, feeling a growing unease. Toby didn't bark this time, but maintained his steady pace, sniffing the air occasionally and pricking up his ears at the slightest sound. As they moved forward, the familiar streets of the town began to fade, and they entered a less frequented area where houses were spaced farther apart, and the shadows grew longer under the dim light of dusk. The path led them to the outskirts of town, where the pavement gave way to a dirt trail. The landscape became more barren, and the feeling of isolation grew stronger. Santiago began to notice a change in Toby's behavior. The dog, who had moved so smoothly before, now paused occasionally, lifting his head and sniffing the air more intently. His fur bristled slightly, and a soft growl escaped his throat each time they approached a specific point along the path. "What are you sensing, Toby?" Santiago thought as he watched the dog with growing interest. The detective's intuition, sharpened by years of experience, told him something was wrong. Finally, after walking for nearly half an hour, they arrived at an old abandoned house. The structure, which had likely been a farm in better times, was in ruins. The windows were broken, and the front door hung from a rusty hinge. Weeds had overtaken the land, nearly covering the path leading to the entrance. Toby stopped in front of the house and began barking more intensely, as if urging Santiago to take action. The dog ran back and forth with frantic energy, scratching the door with his front paws. His behavior made it clear that there was something inside that house that needed to be discovered. Santiago approached cautiously, his hand instinctively resting on the holster of his gun. The sense of danger was palpable, but so was the curiosity. He pushed the door, which creaked as it opened, revealing a dark and dusty interior. The evening light barely penetrated the main room, where the furniture was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs hung from every corner. Detective Santiago stood still for a moment, allowing his eyes to adjust to the gloom that dominated the old house. The atmosphere, thick with oppressive silence, seemed to hold dark secrets that time had tried to bury under layers of dust and neglect. Toby, the faithful four-legged companion, moved forward without hesitation, his nose pressed to the ground, sniffing each corner with precision. It was as if the dog could sense something that escaped human understanding at first glance. Every step Santiago took on the wooden floor emitted an unsettling creak, as if the house itself was whispering warnings from the past. The air was damp, carrying a faint but persistent smell of mold. The dense, heavy atmosphere seemed to wrap around them, tightening with each step they took into the unknown. Toby headed towards a corner of the main room, his fur bristling as though he was preparing to face some invisible danger. Santiago followed closely, his hand still on the gun holster, with a tension he hadn't felt in a long time. The dog began to scratch the floor, his claws making a rough sound as they scraped against the worn wood. The detective turned on his torch and aimed it at where Toby was focused. In the flickering light, he noticed that some of the floorboards seemed poorly fitted, almost as if they had been removed and hastily put back in place. Santiago crouched down, his fingers brushing the cold, damp wood. With some effort, he managed to lift one of the boards, revealing a hidden compartment beneath the floor. Toby started barking insistently, his body trembling with excitement. With adrenaline coursing through his veins, Santiago removed the remaining boards, exposing what appeared to be a secret entrance. A small rusty iron door was embedded in the floor, almost imperceptible if it weren't for the dog's persistence. "This isn't normal," Santiago murmured to himself, feeling a mix of fear and curiosity wash over him. He knew that whatever was behind that door wasn't going to be pleasant. With some effort, Santiago managed to open the door. The screech of the metal echoed throughout the room, heightening the tension in the air. A narrow, dark staircase led downwards into what seemed like a cellar or crypt. The detective felt a chill run down his spine, but he knew there was no turning back. Toby was the first to descend, his steps lightly echoing in the darkness. Santiago followed, descending cautiously, each step creaking under his weight. The air grew heavier and colder as they ventured deeper into the bowels of the house. At the bottom of the stairs, Santiago's torch illuminated a small, stifling room. The walls were covered in mold, and the low ceiling made the space feel even more claustrophobic. Toby was sniffing intently at a corner of the room, barking intermittently, pointing towards something the detective couldn't yet see. As Santiago approached the spot Toby was indicating, he discovered a pile of old boxes stacked carelessly. They were covered in dirty sheets, faded by time. With the torch in one hand and the other ready to act, he began moving the boxes, revealing what lay hidden behind them. Finally, after moving several boxes, he found himself in front of an iron door, rusted and covered in cobwebs. The door was slightly ajar, as if someone had entered or exited recently, but time had almost sealed it shut. "What the hell?" Santiago whispered, feeling the tension in his chest intensify. Toby barked more loudly, urging the detective to open the door and discover what was hidden beyond that threshold. Santiago, with his heart pounding, pushed the door. It opened with a screech that seemed to tear through the silence of the room, revealing a small space beyond. Detective Santiago held the torch firmly, his sweaty hands betraying the tension he felt at that moment. The screech of the door as it opened still echoed in his ears, like an ancient wail revealing dark secrets kept hidden for so long. The flickering light barely illuminated the narrow hallway stretching ahead, and the air grew denser, filled with a stench that he couldn't quite define, but which evoked a sense of decay and desolation. Toby, with his keen sense of smell, proceeded cautiously, sniffing the ground while his ears remained alert, attuned to any sound or movement. The dog, who had until then shown unwavering courage and determination, now moved with a restrained caution, as if sensing that what lay at the end of that hallway was something neither man nor animal should confront. Santiago followed the dog, his footsteps echoing softly on the concrete floor, while his mind tried to anticipate what lay ahead. Every time Toby paused to sniff a corner or raised his nose to test the air, the detective felt the gravity of the situation intensify. The hallway led them to a smaller door, hidden in the shadows. This door didn't bear the rust that had marked the previous one. On the contrary, it appeared to be used frequently, its hinges and handle almost intact, a further sign that the place wasn't as abandoned as it seemed. When Santiago gently pushed the door, it opened without resistance, revealing a small, almost claustrophobic room, with shelves lining the walls, crammed with disordered papers and documents. Toby, not waiting for Santiago's signal, approached one of the shelves, intensely sniffing the piled-up papers. Santiago watched him for a moment, feeling a knot form in his stomach before beginning to examine what lay before him. The detective picked up one of the documents and, under the light of the torch, realized he was holding a passport. However, something didn't add up. The paper was aged, but the photograph appeared more recent. The name, though common, was oddly written, as if it had been altered. As he continued to search, he found more passports, all with names and photographs that didn't match each other. As he progressed with his examination, the horror of what these documents represented slowly dawned on him. Their fake identities, Santiago murmured to himself, his voice barely a whisper in the darkness of the room. Toby, hearing his human companion's voice, looked up for a moment before returning to his sniffing. Among the papers, the detective found more documents that chilled him to the core. There were birth certificates, school records, all kinds of documentation pointing to the existence of children. But what disturbed him most was that the names and faces of those children didn't match anywhere. It was as if someone had tampered with their identities, mixing and concealing them under a web of lies and manipulation. Toby, now restless, began sniffing more vigorously near a stack of boxes at the back of the room. Santiago, following the dog, carefully moved one of the larger boxes, revealing a small metal box hidden in the dark corner. Though covered in dust, the box seemed tightly sealed, as if it contained something of great importance. With trembling hands, Santiago tried to open it, but the lock resisted. After a few moments of effort, he managed to open it, revealing its contents. More documents, but these were different. They weren't just old papers, but detailed files with photographs, physical descriptions, and, most shockingly to Santiago, fingerprints. This isn't just a simple fake document operation, thought Santiago, as he examined the box's contents. This is something much bigger, much more sinister. Meanwhile, Toby was still focused on sniffing a small envelope sticking out from among the papers. Santiago, noticing the dog's interest, picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside, he found several Polaroid photographs, all of children. But these weren't ordinary photos. Each one showed the children in deplorable conditions, their faces etched with fear and despair, images that tore at Santiago's heart. "Oh my God!" he exclaimed, feeling the air leave his lungs. The pictures were clear evidence that these children had been subjected to something horrific, something that was now in Santiago's hands to uncover and stop. The detective tucked the photographs and the most crucial documents into his jacket, knowing these were the threads that would help them unravel the network hidden behind those moldy walls. But as he did so, he couldn't help but think of how many more had passed through the place. How many lives had been destroyed in those dark rooms? Toby, with his unerring instinct, stayed by Santiago's side, as if understanding the weight of what they had uncovered. His eyes, shining in the dim light, seemed to reflect the same determination that now burned in the detective's heart. "Let's go, boy," said Santiago, with a mixture of sadness and resolve in his voice. "We need to get out of here and end this once and for all." Toby barked softly in response, wagging his tail as he headed towards the exit. Detective Santiago walked towards the exit, feeling the weight of what he had uncovered in that dark basement. The tension was evident in every step, and although the cold night air hit his face, the darkness he had left behind still pressed heavily on his chest. Toby, ever faithful, walked beside him, his small body radiating a calm that contrasted with the storm brewing in Santiago's mind. The dog kept Noelia's blanket in his teeth, as if that worn piece of fabric was his anchor in a world full of uncertainty and horror. Upon arriving at the station, Santiago was met by a team of officers waiting for him, their faces reflecting the same seriousness and concern he felt. There was no time to waste. What they had discovered that night couldn't be buried in reports and bureaucracy. They knew that every minute counted, that every second lost meant more danger for the children still in the hands of those monsters. "We need to act fast," said Santiago, his voice firm but laced with a tension he couldn't hide. "What we found is just the tip of the iceberg. If we don't move now, who knows how many more will suffer?" The officers nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Within minutes, the station transformed into a frenzy of operations. Maps, reports, and photos were spread across the tables as they discussed the possible locations of other hideouts linked to this human trafficking ring. The information was scarce, fragmented, but the urgency forced them to make swift and precise decisions. Toby, meanwhile, rested in a corner of the room, his gaze fixed on the activity around him. Although he appeared calm, anyone watching closely would notice how he kept Noelia's blanket close, his breathing slightly faster. It was as if the dog understood that the battle wasn't over yet, that there was more work to be done, more lives to save. The chief of the station, a man whose face bore the marks of years of service, approached Santiago. "We're going to need everyone on this, Santiago. We can't afford to let a single one of those bastards get away." "I know," replied Santiago, his voice reflecting the determination he'd felt since entering that cursed house. "But we also need to be careful. We can't risk the lives of those children." The conversation was brief but enough for both men to understand they were on the same page. It wasn't just about catching the criminals, but about doing so without causing more harm to the victims. With the plans ready and the team in position, Santiago stepped out of the operations room, taking a moment to breathe deeply. Outside, the night was colder, and the silence felt oppressive after the bustle inside the station. Toby, sensing that the detective needed a moment alone, stayed inside, watching from a distance. Santiago knew that what lay ahead wouldn't be easy. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this time it was different. The images of the children in that basement wouldn't stop haunting his mind. He knew that the operation they were about to launch wasn't just an opportunity to catch those responsible, but a chance to save lives, to give those little ones hope again. "We're going to need all the help we can get," he muttered to himself as his mind ran through every detail of the plan. Back at the station, Toby had curled up next to his blanket, his loyal companion throughout this ordeal. Some officers watched him with a mixture of admiration and affection, knowing that without that brave dog, they might never have uncovered what was hidden in that place. As the operation prepared to kick into gear, the officers armed themselves with more than just weapons. They carried the weight of knowing they were fighting something more than mere criminals. They were fighting a deep-rooted evil, born from the worst parts of humanity. "It's time," said the chief of the station, breaking the silence of the night. The men and women around him nodded, preparing for what was to come. Santiago took one last look at the station before heading out, noticing how Toby stood up and watched him as he left. The police convoy set off into the darkness, its lights cutting through the night as they moved towards their target. The road ahead was filled with uncertainty, but the determination in the hearts of the officers never wavered. They knew that this night would be decisive, that there would be no second chances. The night enveloped the convoy like a silent shroud, barely disturbed by the soft hum of the engines. The vehicles, with their lights off, slid like shadows along the deserted roads, drawing ever closer to the warehouse looming ominously in the distance. Inside the patrol cars, the atmosphere was thick with tension, every officer knowing that what they were about to face Detective Santiago kept his eyes fixed on the darkness, his mind running through every detail of the plan they had laid out. He knew there was no room for mistakes. Every move had to be precise, every action calculated. Beside him, a younger officer was breathing deeply, trying to calm the nerves that were getting the better of him. Santiago, noticing his agitation, placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Remember, we're here to save lives," he murmured with a calmness that barely concealed the internal storm he himself was feeling. "Stay focused, and everything will be fine." The young officer nodded, clinging to those words like an anchor in a sea of uncertainty. The minutes stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity as the convoy advanced. Finally, the warehouse came into view, an imposing, crumbling structure that looked more like a tomb than a refuge. Yet they knew that behind those decaying walls, a silent battle was being fought for the lives and hopes of those who had been torn from their families. The convoy stopped at a safe distance, the officers exiting the vehicles in near reverent silence. Orders were whispered in the dim light as they organized to surround the building. Santiago led his team towards the main entrance, their steps silent but filled with a determination born from the need for justice. Once in position, the operation leader gave the signal. With swift, synchronized movements, the officers forced open the main door, entering the warehouse with their weapons ready. Inside, the place was bathed in shadows, with the few flickering lights barely illuminating the vast space filled with crates and abandoned machinery. The air was thick with a stale smell, a mix of dust and despair that seemed to have seeped into every corner. Santiago moved forward cautiously, his torch sweeping through the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. Around him, the other officers did the same, their senses sharpened by the adrenaline coursing through their veins. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the soft hum of electricity and the occasional creak of the floor beneath their boots. Suddenly, a dull thud echoed from the back of the warehouse. Everyone froze, their bodies tense like coiled springs ready to snap. Santiago raised his hand, signaling his team to prepare. The sound repeated, louder this time, as if someone was moving something heavy. "Over here!" Santiago whispered, moving towards the source of the sound with his heart pounding in his chest. Each step brought him closer to what they knew would be a decisive confrontation. As they rounded a corner, they were met with a scene that made time seem to stop. A group of armed men was standing next to a row of metal cages, each containing a group of terrified children. The flickering lights reflected the fear in the children's eyes, and among them, one girl stood out, her gaze, though frightened, still shining with a glimmer of hope. It was Noelia. Without wasting a second, the officers sprang into action. A volley of gunfire erupted, the deafening sound echoing off the warehouse's metal walls. The armed men, caught off guard by the sudden arrival of the police, attempted to resist, but the training and coordination of the officers quickly prevailed. Santiago, his torch fixed on the cages, ran towards them, his mind focused solely on the children trapped inside. The locks were old and rusty, but not strong enough to withstand the determination of the officers. With trembling but steady hands, Santiago opened the cage where Noelia was. The girl, though clearly exhausted and scared, looked up, and her eyes met Santiago's. "Everything will be all right now," he said in a soft but firm voice. Noelia said nothing, but her tear-filled eyes spoke for her. She knew she was finally safe. The other officers continued to free the children, who clung to their rescuers with the desperation of those who had known true terror. Some wept, others were in a silent state of shock, but they all shared the same expression of relief, knowing that their nightmare was coming to an end. Outside, the sound of sirens began to fill the air as reinforcements and ambulances arrived. The operation, though brief, had been intense, and every officer knew that what they had achieved that night was nothing short of a miracle. Santiago, holding Noelia in his arms, emerged from the warehouse and handed her over to the waiting paramedics. The exhaustion finally caught up with him, but not before he saw Noelia being carefully attended to and taken to an ambulance. Her small body trembled, but her eyes still reflected that spark of hope that had never left her. As the warehouse emptied and the officers secured the area, Santiago stood at the entrance, watching as the night began to fade with the first light of dawn. He knew there was still much to do, but for now they could breathe a little easier. The sun began to paint the sky with soft shades of pink and orange as the convoy of patrol cars returned to the station. It had been long hours, filled with tension and danger, but the knowledge that they had saved those children gave them a brief respite, a quiet satisfaction visible on the tired faces of the officers. Noelia, barely conscious after being checked by the paramedics, was taken to the station in one of the ambulances. Her small body, wrapped in a thermal blanket, trembled slightly, not so much from the cold, but from the exhaustion and trauma of what she had endured. However, her eyes, which had once shone with hope amidst the horror, were now dimmed, as if all the energy she had used to survive had drained away. Toby, who had spent the previous night at the station, was restless. He had sensed Santiago's absence, the tension in the air, and something else he couldn't fully understand, but which kept him in a constant state of alert. When he heard the sound of sirens announcing the convoy's arrival, he immediately stood up, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of anxiety and expectation. The station doors opened, and in an instant, Toby bolted out, his paws hitting the ground with an urgency he hadn't shown before. The officers outside were surprised to see the dog running so quickly towards the ambulance that had just pulled up. Santiago, who knew him well, immediately understood what Toby had sensed. It wasn't just the need to know that everything was all right. It was something deeper, a connection that had kept the dog alive throughout that terrible ordeal. When the ambulance door opened and the paramedics helped Noelia out, Toby stopped abruptly, his eyes locking onto the girl's. The recognition was immediate. A sharp bark filled with pent-up emotion escaped from Toby, and with a desperate leap, he rushed towards Noelia. "Noelia," her mother murmured, barely able to hold back her tears as she saw her daughter clutching the blanket around her. But before she could reach her, Toby was already by her side, jumping and spinning, his body bursting with energy. Noelia, still somewhat disoriented, looked up and saw him. Her eyes, which had been dull moments before, suddenly lit up, and for a moment all the horror she had experienced seemed to fade away. "Toby!" Noelia cried out, with a mixture of disbelief and joy, stretching her arms towards the dog. Toby, without hesitation, leapt into her embrace, licking her face with unwavering devotion as Noelia hugged him tightly, as if he were the anchor keeping her grounded in reality. Noelia's parents, who had been standing aside, watched with tears in their eyes, unable to contain their emotion. They had feared the worst, but now, seeing their daughter reunited with Toby, they knew that somehow everything would be all right. "This dog," Noelia's father began, his voice breaking with emotion. "He never stopped looking for her. He left the house with that old blanket and didn't return until now." The officers, including Santiago, listened in silence, moved by the story unfolding before them. Noelia's mother, visibly emotional, knelt to stroke Toby, her hands trembling as she did so. "That blanket," she said, "was Noelia's favorite when she was little. She always carried it with her, and it seems Toby kept it as a reminder of her all this time." Santiago, who had seen many things in his career, felt his heart tighten upon hearing those words. There was something deeply touching about the loyalty of that dog, about his determination not to abandon Noelia, even when the world seemed to have turned against them. As Toby continued licking Noelia's face, as if trying to wash away all the invisible wounds the girl had suffered, one of the nurses approached gently. "We need to take her inside for a more thorough checkup," she said softly, knowing that interrupting this moment would be painful, but also necessary. Noelia, still clinging to Toby, nodded slowly. She seemed to understand, though it was clear she didn't want to be separated from her loyal friend. Toby, as if he understood what was happening, stayed close, his fur brushing against Noelia's leg as they led her inside the station. The officers stepped aside, some discreetly wiping away tears as the family entered the station. Santiago watched in silence, his thoughts filled with a mix of sadness, relief, and admiration for the unbreakable bond between Noelia and Toby. In the days that followed, the story of Toby and Noelia spread quickly. It became a symbol of hope, of the strength that can emerge in the darkest moments. News outlets spoke of the dog who, driven by a love beyond human comprehension, had been the guiding thread that led the police to the truth, saving not only Noelia, but many other children who had also suffered. The days after the rescue were full of activity, but also meaningful silences. The outside world, with its constant noise and rush, faded away in the room where Noelia and Toby spent most of their time. The girl, still fragile, clung to her recovery with a quiet strength, while Toby remained by her side, ever watchful, as if he knew his mission wasn't completely over. The authorities worked tirelessly to tie up all the loose ends. The main leaders of the criminal organization had been captured, and interrogations revealed more and more details about the scale of their operations. The documents recovered, which at first seemed like simple papers, became key pieces in unraveling an international network that had operated in the shadows for far too long. With the collaboration of international agencies, the Mexican police ensured that the rescued children were returned to their homes, if they still had them, or received the care needed to start a new life. At the station, the news of the arrests was met with a mixture of relief and pain. Relief because justice was beginning to be served, but pain in the realization that each arrest, each document uncovered, was a testament to the suffering of many innocent victims. Yet, amidst that harsh reality, the story of Noelia and Toby offered a glimmer of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, kindness and loyalty could prevail. Noelia, under the attentive care of doctors and psychologists, began to show signs of recovery. At first, her days were marked by confusion and fear, but with each new day, Toby's presence by her side slowly restored her confidence. Her family, who had lived a nightmare since her disappearance, stayed close, grateful for every smile they managed to coax out of her, for every small step that brought her closer to her old self. "It's incredible what an animal can do for a human being," one of the psychologists remarked, while observing the interaction between Noelia and Toby. He didn't just protect her physically, but now he's helping to rebuild her spirit. Toby, unaware of the conversations and admiring glances, had only one goal: to stay by Noelia's side. His days of wandering were over. He had found his place, his home, and he had no intention of leaving it. Every night as Noelia slept, he curled up at her feet, his head resting on the blanket he had carried for so long, a constant reminder of the battle they had both survived. Visits to the station became routine for the townspeople who wanted to see the dog that had become a local legend. The children especially arrived with treats and toys, hoping to steal a bit of his attention, though Toby rarely took his eyes off Noelia. To him, the rest of the world was secondary. As the weeks passed, Noelia began going outside more, always accompanied by Toby. Their walks in the park, once filled with fear and caution, became moments of peace, where the girl could be what she was, a child. The whispers and comments from the neighbors, which would have frightened her before, now comforted her. She knew she wasn't alone, that there was a whole town ready to protect her. Toby's story spread beyond the town. Soon, news outlets from all over the country began talking about him, and it wasn't long before his story crossed borders. TV programs, newspaper articles, all told the tale of the dog who had saved a girl and who, in the process, had uncovered a child trafficking network. For Noelia's family, and for Noelia herself, Toby wasn't just a hero. He was an indispensable member of the family. They couldn't imagine their life without him, and when they finally returned home, it was with Toby by their side. Their house, which had been filled with deep sadness for months, was once again alive with the sound of Noelia's laughter and Toby's happy barks. "This dog isn't just a pet," Noelia's father would tell his neighbors. "He's a miracle, a true angel that God sent to bring our daughter back." Days turned into months, and although Noelia's life would never be exactly the same, the girl regained the joy and confidence she'd lost. Toby, always faithful, accompanied her everywhere, her constant shadow, her tireless guardian. The entire town celebrated when Noelia returned to school. It was a day full of emotions, of tears and smiles. Toby, of course, was there, waiting for her at the school gates as if he knew this was an important step in the girl's recovery. The story of Toby and Noelia left an indelible mark on the hearts of everyone who heard it. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, kindness and loyalty can light the way. Toby had not only saved Noelia, he had restored the faith of an entire town in love's ability to overcome any obstacle. And so, as the days passed and life slowly returned to normal, Toby and Noelia remained inseparable. The girl, now stronger and wiser, knew there was something special about her bond with Toby, something that went beyond words. It was a bond forged in pain, but strengthened by love and hope. In time, the story of Toby and Noelia became a local legend, told from generation to generation, a symbol of the bravery and loyalty that can be found in the most unexpected places. And though the years passed and life carried on, Toby was always remembered as the dog who, with his unconditional love, brought light back to a world shrouded in darkness. The story of Toby and Noelia is a touching testament to the deep bond that can exist between humans and animals. Through his unwavering loyalty and love, Toby not only became Noelia's protector, but also a symbol of hope and resilience for everyone. His relentless search for Noelia, guided only by his instinct and affection, demonstrates that animals have an extraordinary capacity to feel and act with an empathy that transcends human understanding. Toby's journey reminds us that love and devotion know no bounds, and that even in the darkest moments, the presence of a loved one, whether human or animal, can make the difference between despair and hope. The story highlights the importance of the emotional connection between people and their pets, showing how these bonds can be a refuge in times of adversity. The tale of Toby and Noelia teaches us that, in their innocence and purity, animals offer us valuable lessons about the power of unconditional love, loyalty, and the ability to heal, both physically and emotionally. If you find the characters' journeys inspiring, please like and comment to share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more uplifting stories that highlight the power of connection and human kindness. Thank you for watching.